The morning fog hung low over the Argonne Forest, a gray blanket that swallowed sound and distorted distance. Leaves, slick with dew, glistened faintly as the men of the 77th Division marched into the unknown, their boots sinking into the damp earth with every cautious step. It was September 1918, and the First World War was in its final, brutal months. Yet for the soldiers, each day felt endless, and each step could be their last. Major Charles Whittlesey walked at the front of the column, his uniform covered in mud, his eyes scanning the horizon through the mist. Around him, 554 men followed, a mix of raw recruits and seasoned soldiers, all carrying the weight-off rifles, packs, and the unspoken dread of what lay ahead. Some tried to joke, shaking the tension from their shoulders. Others moved in silence, faces pale, muscles tense, hearts hammering in rhythm with the march. The forest seemed alive, as though it could sense their intrusion. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves set nerves on edge. The sound of distant artillery echoed like a low drum, a grim reminder that the German lines were not far. Birds, unervingly silent, watched from the branches. The air smelled damp, earthy, and metallic, tinged with the faint smoke of previous skirmishes. For the men, it was beautiful and terrifying at once, a place of shadow and concealment, yet also of sudden death. As they advanced deeper, the battalion's formation became tighter, moving cautiously along narrow trails that wound like veins through the dense woodland. Whittlesey's orders were precise, yet simple: push forward, hold your lines, and above all, maintain discipline. The men understood that survival depended not just on courage, but on cohesion. A single misstep could expose them to hidden German machine gun nests or artillery fire. The tension was palpable. Each soldier carried memories of friends lost in previous battles, and the fear that this march might be their last. Some clutched small photographs tucked inside their pockets, letters from mothers, sisters, or sweethearts. A young private whispered a prayer under his breath, barely audible over the crunch of the forest floor. Every footstep, every glance, carried the weight of uncertainty, and yet the battalion pressed on, driven by duty, camaraderie, and sheer will. By midday, they reached a clearing, only to be met with the first signs of danger. Shattered trees, torn earth, and the distant flash of artillery fire painted a stark picture of the forest ahead. Whittlesey ordered the men to disperse slightly, moving cautiously as scouts edged forward to observe enemy positions. The mist worked both ways: it shielded them from view, but also concealed threats. Every shadow could be a German soldier, every crack of a branch a warning of impending fire. Conversations among the men were sparse. When one spoke, it was usually a low murmur, a question about rations, or a word of encouragement. Their eyes darted constantly, scanning the tree-line, the underbrush, every potential ambush point. Some gripped their rifles so tightly that knuckles whitened, others wiped sweat from their foreheads, aware that panic could spread faster than bullets. Whittlesey paused occasionally, scanning his men, understanding the fear they carried. He knew that leadership was not just about orders, but about calm in the face of chaos, reassurance when the world seemed ready to collapse. Every decision he made now could save lives or doom them. He whispered instructions quietly, methodically, trying to instill confidence even as the weight of responsibility pressed on him like the fog itself. As evening approached, the battalion reached the edge of a ravine, where the forest opened slightly. The men paused to rest, to eat what little rations remained, and to take stock. Whittlesey took a moment to survey the horizon. Beyond the trees, German lines awaited, strong and prepared, though not yet aware of the path the battalion had chosen. It was a moment of eerie calm before the storm, a fleeting breath before the trap slowly began to close around them. The Argonne Forest was unforgiving. Every day held the possibility of death, every night was filled with uncertainty. Yet the men of the 77th Division moved forward, unaware that in the days to come, they would be trapped behind enemy lines, isolated and outnumbered, forced to fight not just for victory, but for survival itself. And in the quiet moments between marches, whispers of anxiety and courage alike passed among the men: who would fall first, who would hold, and whether they could endure the forest's dark embrace. Little did they know, this first step into the mist would mark the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would test every ounce of their resolve, loyalty, and humanity. The dawn was gray and heavy, the forest shrouded in a thin mist that clung to uniforms and rifles alike. The men of the 77th Division stirred quietly, breaking their brief rest from the previous night's march. Fatigue pressed on them like a tangible weight, but there was no time to linger. Orders had come down: advance. Push forward through the Argonne, take the German line, and hold ground. Major Charles Whittlesey moved among his men, checking faces, offering words of quiet reassurance. His eyes scanned every movement, noting tension, hesitation, and the subtle flicker of fear. The men responded to his presence not just as a commander, but as a steadying force, a reminder that even in the midst of uncertainty, there was purpose. As they pressed into the forest, the canopy thickened, filtering sunlight into fractured beams that danced across mud and fallen leaves. Each step seemed heavier than the last, each rustle in the underbrush sounded like a warning. Scouts moved ahead in silence, rifles raised, ears straining for any sign of enemy presence. And then, just as the battalion rounded a bend, the first distant crack of German rifle fire shattered the fragile calm. The sound was startling, echoing through the trees and freezing men in their tracks. Whittlesey raised his hand, signaling for caution. Orders were shouted in brief, clipped bursts. The men ducked, rolled into shallow depressions, and returned fire when possible, though the fog and thick undergrowth made aiming nearly impossible. Anxiety rippled through the ranks. Was this a patrol, or the beginning of a trap? Despite the chaos, camaraderie held firm. A private near the rear offered a weak grin to his companion, whispering, "We'll make it through. We have to." Around him, men nodded, eyes fixed forward, though the tremor in their hands betrayed their fear. They knew instinctively that advancing meant risk, yet retreat was not an option. Every step deeper into the forest was a step into uncertainty, and the thought of what awaited beyond the next ridge lingered like a shadow. Major Whittlesey moved to the front, rifle in hand, making deliberate choices about their path. Communication with other units was limited, radio technology was unreliable, and the dense forest swallowed sound and signal alike. The battalion's cohesion depended entirely on observation, trust, and the discipline of men who had trained for years but had never faced a forest like this under fire. As the morning stretched, skirmishes broke out intermittently. German machine gun nests fired from concealed positions, forcing men to hug the earth, crawl, and flank through the trees. Artillery shells hissed overhead, striking with devastating impact. The ground shook, mud sprayed, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the forest, punctuated by the bark of rifles. In those moments, the forest felt both alive and hostile, a labyrinth of shadow and sound. Whittlesey organized squads to secure flanks, redistribute ammunition, and tend to the injured. Each choice weighed heavily. Sending a group to cover an exposed path could save lives or condemn men to death. The battlefield was unpredictable, a game of survival with stakes higher than any man had imagined. Amidst the gunfire, soldiers clutched letters from home, photographs, or trinkets, grounding themselves in memories of family and normal life. Some whispered prayers, others gritted their teeth and cursed the fog that concealed friend and foe alike. Yet each man pressed forward, driven by a mixture of duty, fear, and the quiet courage that only extreme circumstances could reveal. By midday, the battalion had advanced several miles, yet the sense of isolation grew heavier. Orders from higher command were faint echoes. No one knew exactly where adjacent units were, or if the push ahead was supported. Whittlesey sensed the encroaching danger but could not see it. Every step further into the Argonne was deeper into enemy territory, a decision that would soon define survival. And so, the men of the 77th Division moved onward, their march a mixture of determination and dread. The forest loomed, dense and unforgiving, concealing both death and the courage that would soon be tested beyond measure. Each man carried his own fear, his own hope, and the unspoken question, How long could they continue to advance before the forest itself became their prison? The first bullets of what would become a relentless siege had already flown, and little did the men know that the trap was closing around them, tightening with every step they took. The advance had begun, but the real battle for survival was only just about to start. The forest seemed to close in around them. What had felt like a path forward now became a labyrinth of trees, underbrush, and shadow. The men of the 77th Division moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, senses strained to the breaking point. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt amplified, a potential warning of the enemy just out of sight. The morning sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting a dim, greenish haze that blurred the line between friend and foe. Then came the realization, they were alone. Signals from adjacent units had stopped. No reinforcements were coming. Major Charles Whittlesey felt it first, a cold tightening in his chest that spoke of encirclement. He had trained for chaos, but not for this. 554 men, isolated deep in enemy territory, the terrain masking their movement from their own forces. Every choice now carried life or death consequences. The first volleys of German fire cracked through the forest like snapping whips. Machine guns, previously hidden by thick foliage, opened on the battalion from multiple directions. Men hit the ground, some screaming, others frozen in shock. Mud and leaves mixed with blood, and the scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. In that moment, discipline became survival, scattered panic would mean death. Whittlesey acted swiftly, his voice calm but commanding. Hold your positions, do not advance blindly. Cover your flanks. His presence steadied the men. Even in terror, they followed him, digging shallow foxholes and using the fall entrees for cover. The forest became both shield and cage, concealing them from view, but restricting movement, channeling men into zones where enemy fire was heaviest. As the hours dragged on, the reality became undeniable, the battalion was trapped. German artillery pounded their positions, cutting off retreat and supply lines. Food and water were limited. Ammunition ran low. Every messenger sent to higher command risked capture or death. The men's morale wavered, fear gnawed at their resolve, and yet they clung to discipline, to camaraderie, to the belief that survival demanded order, even amidst chaos. In the quiet moments between bombardments, Whittlesey walked among the men. Some were injured, faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Others murmured letters from home, or clutched keepsakes for courage. A medic moved tirelessly between the wounded, applying bandages soaked in mud and blood, whispering encouragement, and shoving aside his own fear. Small acts of courage became lifelines, quiet, desperate, and often unseen. Every decision weighed heavier than the last. Should they hold their ground or attempt a breakout? Could they trust the forest to hide them, or would the Germans anticipate every move? Whittlesey knew that a single miscalculation could decimate the battalion entirely. He made notes of terrain, potential cover, and enemy positions, calculations that could mean the difference between life and death. By late afternoon, German forces tightened their circle. Flanking maneuvers cut off natural escape routes. Machine guns sweated fire from every side, and snipers picked off anyone who dared to peek above cover. Whittlesey and his officers moved along the lines, bolstering the men, distributing what little ammunition remained, and reinforcing their positions with fallen logs and earth. The battalion was no longer advancing, they were holding, trapped in a forest that was both their refuge and their prison. As night fell, the fog thickened, wrapping the battalion in a ghostly cloak. Sounds of the enemy shifted from the immediate, gunfire, shouts, to distant, ominous movements. Whittlesey lit a single lantern, small but visible only to his men, a beacon of leadership in the dark. Exhaustion weighed on them, but the fear of what would happen if they slept was greater. Every man understood that the coming hours would be decisive. Survive the night, and there might be a chance for relief. Fail, and the forest would claim them. Amid the darkness, whispers circulated: who would make it through? who would fall before dawn? And in the deepest shadows, the men realized something chilling: they were no longer part of a larger offensive. They were isolated, they were alone. They were trapped. The first stage of the nightmare was complete. The battalion was surrounded. And in the silence that followed the artillery's roar, every man felt it in his bones: the real test of courage, endurance, and leadership had only just begun. Amid the chaos of the Argonne Forest, one figure moved with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. Major Charles Whittlesey, uniform dirted and soaked with sweat, walked the line of his trapped battalion, eyes sharp, mind racing with calculations and contingencies. Around him, 554 men huddled in shallow foxholes, behind fallen logs, or pressed against the muddy earth, listening for the next German assault. Fear was a living thing here, a constant presence, yet Whittlesey's resolve became the anchor that held them together. He understood something fundamental: in this forest, leadership was more than giving orders, it was embodying composure, courage, and confidence even when every instinct screamed otherwise. Men glanced at him for reassurance. When Hess spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, cutting through the fog of panic like a beacon. Hold your positions. Stay alert. Watch each other's backs. Small words, but heavy with authority and trust. The artillery fire continued in intermittent bursts, hammering the forest with deafening roars. Splinters of bark flew, mud exploded under impact, and the ground quaked beneath every shell. Soldiers ducked, crawled, and fired in short, measured bursts. Whittlesey moved among them, checking ammunition, redistributing food, tending to the wounded as best he could. He was aware that exhaustion and fear could spread faster than bullets, and it was his duty to keep morale intact. He paused beside a young private whose hands shook uncontrollably. The boy's rifle wavered as his breath came in shallow gasps. Whittlesey placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, meeting his eyes. "You are not alone," he said quietly. "We survive together." That small reassurance seemed to infuse courage, however fleeting, into the man's veins. Moments like this became as crucial as the firing lines themselves. Decision-making was relentless. Each choice, from where to position men to how to ration the dwindling supplies, was a gamble. Whittlesey knew that German forces would adapt, anticipate, and exploit any mistake. He instructed squads to hold their flanks, coordinated sniper positions, and improvised barricades with whatever the forest provided. Every fallen branch became cover, every mound offered a potential shield. But leadership was not just tactical, it was psychological. Whittlesey had turbulence fear with hope, exhaustion with determination. In the brief lull between attacks, he gathered the men, sharing information, offering words of encouragement, and reminding them of their duty. "We may be surrounded, but we're not defeated. Stay vigilant, stay alive." His calm presence was contagious. Even in isolation, the battalion found structure, order, and purpose. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Whittlesey felt the weight of responsibility as a physical burden. Every man's life rested on his decisions, and the thought of failure was ever present. He knew that if the battalion fell, it would not only be a tactical loss, but a human tragedy, friends and comrades lost in a forest that would swallow their names. As night descended, Whittlesey walked along the line once more, lantern in hand. Shadows flickered across weary faces, eyes wide and haunted. He listened to the quiet whispers, the prayers, the soft murmurs of men trying to hold on to hope. Each step reminded him of the fragility of life, and the extraordinary courage that ordinary men could summon under unimaginable pressure. Even in the encirclement, there were moments of heroism. A medic crawled through shellfire to save a wounded comrade, a soldier braved machine gun fire to deliver ammunition to a neighboring foxhole. Whittlesey recognized each act, understanding that leadership was also about witnessing bravery, validating it, and ensuring it inspired others. The night in the Argonne was long, oppressive, filled with unseen threats and the distant rumble of artillery. Yet Major Whittlesey's presence, his deliberate calm, and his unwavering focus gave the battalion a chance to endure. In the heart of the forest, with death whispering at every turn, his leadership became more than rank, it became a lifeline, the thread that held 554 men together against overwhelming odds. As the hours crept toward dawn, whispers of strategy, courage, and survival intertwined. The forest remained a cage, but Whittlesey's steady hand reminded them that even in isolation, humanity, leadership, and bravery could carve a path through the darkness. Little did they know, the challenges ahead would test not just their courage, but the limits of endurance, loyalty, and the human spirit itself. The forest never slept. Even when the artillery's roar faded into the distance, the Argonne whispered its threats, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the distant murmur of German patrols. The men of the 77th Division awoke to this relentless symphony, eyes heavy, bodies aching, faces streaked with mud and soot. Every breath carried the scent of damp earth, gunpowder, and fear. Life under siege was measured in moments, not hours. Breakfast was a hasty bite off hardtack or stale rations, eaten while keeping one eye on the trees. There was little comfort, and even the smallest tasks carried danger. Fetching water from a stream meant exposure to sniper fire. Tending the wounded required crawling through mud, blood, and debris. Every decision was a gamble with mortality. Soldiers huddled in shallow trenches and makeshift foxholes, trying to rest, trying to sleep, knowing that any sound could betray their position. The nights were long and cold, shadows stretching across faces, highlighting hollow eyes and gaunt expressions. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses at fate, yet amidst exhaustion, bonds deepened. Men shared stories, photographs, and memories of home, clinging to humanity amidst the chaos. Rations ran thin. Ammunition became precious. Medics worked tirelessly, improvising with whatever supplies remained. Bandages were torn from old clothing, morphine was rationed, and hope became a fragile resource as vital as water. Yet even in scarcity, courage persisted. One man crawled through enemy fire to deliver a handful of bullets, another risked his life to drag a comrade from a shell crater. These small acts were monumental in the forest, where survival depended on unity. Communication with the outside world was sparse. Messages were sent with carrier pigeons, notes squeezed into canisters, or shouted signals through the mist, but many never reached command. Each failed attempt added to the anxiety, as men wondered if anyone even knew they were trapped. Rumors drifted through Thelons, "Reinforcements are coming," they whispered. They must be. Yet hope was tempered by realism, the understanding that every second alone increased the peril. The psychological strain was immense. Men wrestled with fear, guilt, and despair. A young private cried silently for his mother. A corporal cursed himself for not acting faster during a skirmish. Whittlesey moved among them, offering reassurance where he could, observing the faint tremors of panic, and reminding them of their duty. Leadership became a lifeline, guiding not just strategy but the fragile morale of hundreds of souls trapped in the forest. Time blurred. Days and nights melded together. Shellfire, gunshots, the moans of the wounded, and the unrelenting presence of danger created a continuous tension. Yet the men adapted. They found routines, digging deeper into mud, reinforcing barricades, scavenging what could be salvaged. Even in the absence of sunlight or news, life, fierce, stubborn, human, persisted. Whittlesey kept a mental ledger of his men's strengths, weaknesses, and needs that he rotated men when possible, ensured someone always watched the perimeter, and listened to whispers of fear and hope alike. Leadership in the forest was about survival, about instilling discipline while honoring humanity, and about making impossible decisions under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Through the smoke, mud, and shadows, the battalion endured. Small victories, holding a position against enemy fire, rescuing a wounded comrade, successfully sending a message, became monumental triumphs. Each day under siege was a testament to resilience, courage, and the relentless determination to survive. Yet for all their endurance, the forest remained a trap. Supplies dwindled, casualties mounted. The weight of isolation pressed harder with every hour. And though the men clung to hope, the looming question haunted every heartbeat: how long could they endure before the forest itself became their tomb? The forest pressed in tighter each day, a living cage of trees and shadows muffling sound and swallowing movement. The 554 men of the 77th Division, trapped behind enemy lines, understood a brutal truth: survival depended not only on courage but on contact with the outside world. And yet, every attempt to reach their own forces was a gamble with life itself. Major Whittlesey surveyed his men with quiet urgency. Food and water were scarce, ammunition dwindled, and exhaustion etched deep lines into every face, but morale, fragile as it was, could not break entirely. A lifeline, however tenuous, was required, a call for help. The forest, dense and unyielding, made this nearly impossible. Radio equipment was unreliable, the thick canopy and shell-shattered terrain distorted signals. Pigeons became their messengers, and hope became tethered to feathered wings. Carrier pigeons were prepared, tiny capsules strapped to their legs with messages scrawled in pencil. "We are surrounded, need immediate assistance," one read. A soldier's hand trembled as he released the bird into the mist, eyes following its ascent into the gray canopy. Each pigeon carried a sliver of hope and yet a haunting uncertainty: would it survive? Would the message reach command? Or would the bird be shot down, leaving them completely isolated? Meanwhile, men devised makeshift signals, waving colored cloths, building smoky fires, and even attempting reflections with mirrors where sunlight dared pierce the forest. Each action was perilous, every movement could betray their position to German snipers and patrols. Anxiety crackled through the lines like static electricity, each man acutely aware that a single misstep could be fatal. Nightfall brought little respite. Soldiers huddled in mud and debris, listening to distant enemy patrols, imagining figures moving among the trees. The silence between artillery bursts was nearly deafening, punctuated only by the soft cuss-off pigeons, some returning, some lost. Whittlesey paced the lines, lantern in hand, ensuring watch rotations and reinforcing morale. He whispered encouragement to men whose courage faltered: "Help will come. We must hold. We survive together." Messages occasionally reached their own forces. When news of their position and predicament arrived at higher command, plans for relief began to take shape, though slow and uncertain. Every hour was a test of patience, endurance, and faith. The men of the battalion understood that relief might arrive, but they also knew it could be delayed or fail entirely. The tension between hope and despair became almost unbearable. The psychological toll was profound. Soldiers stared at empty skies, watching for the flutter of wings, listening for distant shouts, hoping against reason. Some muttered prayers. Others wrote letters to loved ones, aware they might never be sent. Every heartbeat was a reminder of isolation, every breath a fragile testament to survival. And yet, small victories kept them going. Pigeons reached command. Messages returned with coordinates and promises of reinforcements. Whittlesey shared these glimmers of hope with his men, understanding the delicate balance between expectation and disappointment. "We are not forgotten," he told them. "Help is coming. Stand firm." But the Germans were relentless. They observed the battalion, adapted to movements, and intensified artillery and sniper fire. Each call for help became not only a lifeline but a potential exposure. Every bird sent, every signal flashed, could hasten death as easily as rescue. The battalion existed in this fragile, lethal balance, between isolation and salvation, between fear and the fragile thread of hope. As night deepened, the forest seemed almost alive, whispering threats through the rustling leaves. The battalion clung to its routines, its small victories, and the belief that help would arrive. Each man silently asked himself, would they be saved? Could they hold long enough? The forest, indifferent to courage or fear, waited patiently, and the battalion prepared to endure, hoping their calls for help would not be in vain. The forest of Argonne had become a crucible of courage, a place where ordinary men performed acts that defied fear, exhaustion, and reason. Every shell crater, every shattered tree, became a stage for heroism, and for sacrifice. Among the 554 men of the 77th Division, bravery was no longer optional, it was survival itself. The day began like many others, mud-clogged boots, sweat-streaked faces, and rifles at the ready. Yet for these men, each moment carried amplified weight. A medic crawled across open ground, exposed to enemy fire, to reach a wounded comrade. His uniform was ripped, his hands slick with blood and grime, yet he persisted, whispering reassurances as he stabilized the injured soldier. Around him, others covered his approach, a living shield of comradeship. Elsewhere, a young private, barely 20, braved machine gun fire to deliver a fresh bandolier of ammunition to a squad pinned down by German sharpshooters. Bullets whistled past, splintering wood and kicking up earth, yet he ran with single-minded determination, knowing that hesitation would cost lives. Each act of courage, small or monumental, resonated through the battalion, inspiring others to hold their lines and continue fighting. Major Whittlesey moved among them, observing, guiding, and making impossible decisions. He dispatched men to reinforce weakened positions, choosing who would advance and who would stay behind. Each order carried a moral weight heavier than any artillery shell. Every choice meant risking lives, and yet leadership demanded action. There was no room for doubt, only the hard calculus of survival. Sacrifice became routine. A corporal, seeing a grenade land near a group of men, threw himself on it, absorbing the blast to save his comrades. A soldier gave office rations to another who was weaker, starved, and trembling with exhaustion. These acts were not recorded in any official log, but they were etched into the memories of those who witnessed them, binding men together with an unspoken code of shared endurance. The psychological toll was relentless. Fear gnawed at every mind, whispering of death and failure. Some men broke, weeping silently in the shadows, while others steeled themselves with grim resolve. Whittlesey recognized the signs of mental strain and sought to mitigate them, offering words, rotations, and small comforts whenever possible. Leadership in this forest was as much about preserving humanity as it was about tactical positioning. Shellfire and rifle bursts came in waves, unpredictable and punishing. Yet the battalion adapted, using fallen trees, shell craters, and the terrain itself to create a defensive network. Each successful defense was a small triumph, each repelled German advance a reminder that even isolated, outnumbered, and exhausted, they could endure. Courage became contagious, bravery, a lifeline. As the day drew on, casualties mounted. Men carried their wounded friends across exposed ground, refusing to leave anyone behind. Some whispered last words toadying comrades, others clutched keepsakes from home as if they could anchor their souls. Amid the suffering, a profound humanity emerged, a testament that even in hell, compassion could exist. And yet, for all the heroism, the forest was indifferent. It offered no respite, no mercy. Every victory was fleeting, every act of courage met with relentless pressure from the enemy. The battalion learned that heroism was not a guarantee of survival, it was a necessity, a defiance of fate itself. By nightfall, the men were exhausted beyond measure, yet spirits were strangely buoyed by the knowledge that they had endured another day. The forest still surrounded them, shadows stretching across the mud, hiding dangers and possibilities alike. Whittlesey walked the line once more, quietly acknowledging the sacrifices and courage he witnessed. He knew that the coming days would demand even more, every man tested not just in skill, but in spirit. Little did they know, the siege would escalate further. The enemy would tighten its grip, supplies would dwindle even more, and acts of heroism would become both more frequent and more harrowing. In the heart of the Argonne, the 77th Division had discovered a grim truth: survival demanded not just courage, but selflessness, endurance, and the unwavering belief that even in isolation humanity could prevail. The forest seemed to shrink with every passing hour. The Argonne, once a confusing maze of trees and underbrush, became a tightening trap, funneling the 554 men of the 77th Division into increasingly perilous positions. German forces had begun to fully realize the battalion's isolation, and their response was ruthless, methodical, and unrelenting. Artillery shells rained down with frightening precision, ripping earth, splintering trees, and throwing men into muddy craters. The deafening roar of explosions, punctuated by the screams of the wounded, created a relentless symphony of terror. Every flash of movement was an invitation to enemy fire. The battalion's position was no longer hidden, it was a target. Snipers emerged from concealed positions, picking off anyone brave, or desperate, enough to peek above cover. The men ducked, fired from prone positions, and relied on instinct and training to survive. Every step, every movement, was calculated, measured, and fraught with mortal risk. Some froze in fear, others steeled themselves for the inevitability of combat. Major Whittlesey moved along the line, lantern in hand, coordinating defenses with a calm that belied the chaos. He reinforced weak points, redistributed ammunition, and shouted instructions over the din of artillery. His presence was a lifeline, keeping fear from metastasizing into panic. Hold fast. Watch your sectors. Help is coming. His voice cut through the gunfire like a beacon, anchoring men who teetered on the edge of despair. The encirclement tightened with precision. German machine gun positions flanked the battalion, artillery zeroed in on supply points, and patrols tested every weak spot. The forest, dense and deceptive, offered no true sanctuary. Every attempted movement drew fire, every pause risked discovery. Survival demanded vigilance, improvisation, and unyielding nerve. Food and water had become precious commodities. Men scavenged whatever they could, sharing rations, conserving ammunition, and improvising with fallen trees and debris to fortify their positions. The wounded were tended to with makeshift bandages, their cries muffled by the persistent roar of artillery. Exhaustion, fear, and hunger mingled, creating an almost palpable weight pressing down one very soldier. Yet even in the face of relentless pressure, heroism persisted. Soldiers risked everything to carry supplies, rescue comrades, or reinforce defenses. Each act was amplified by the stakes. One misstep could cost not only the individual but their entire squad. Courage became instinct, morality intertwined with survival, and sacrifice an ever-present reality. Whittlesey calculated every move with precision. He understood the forest, the enemy, and the limits of human endurance. Rotations were ordered to prevent collapse, defensive positions reinforced with whatever materials were at hand, and morale maintained through calm words and shared moments of humanity. Even under siege, he knew that a leader's steadiness could be the difference between endurance and annihilation. Nightfall brought a grim silence, but the tension never abated. The battalion was exhausted, their bodies battered, their minds strained to the brink. Fires were low or non-existent. Shadows stretched like fingers across the forest floor, and every rustle suggested the enemy was watching, waiting, calculating. Sleep was impossible, and even rest was temporary, punctuated by sporadic gunfire and the ever-present fear of discovery. The noose was tightening. The forest was no longer a hiding place, it was a gauntlet. Every passing hour increased danger, depleted supplies, and tested the endurance of men already pushed beyond limits. Yet amidst the fear, the courage of the battalion persisted, anchored by leadership, camaraderie, and a stubborn will to survive. Little did they know that the days ahead would test them even further. Reinforcements were approaching, but so too was the enemy's resolve. The Argonne had become a proving ground, where survival demanded not only skill and courage, but an unyielding spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the enemy tightened its grip, every heartbeat, every whispered prayer, became a defiance against the shadow of annihilation. The night hung heavy over the Argonne, thick fog swallowing sound and shadow alike. For days, the battalion had been trapped, isolated from command, with every attempt to signal for help fraught with peril. Morale teetered on a knife's edge, exhaustion gnawed at minds and bodies, and the ever-present roar-off artillery reminded them of how fragile life had become. Then, a small miracle. A carrier pigeon, one of the battalion's few lifelines, managed to slip past the enemy lines. Its wings beat furiously against the mist as it carried a message tied securely to its leg, a plea for rescue, coordinates of the trapped battalion, a desperate cry from the men who refused to surrender to isolation. Whittlesey watched it vanish into the gray canopy, the tiniest spark of hope flickering in his eyes. When confirmation arrived hours later, it was almost surreal. Command had received the message. Plans were being made. Relief forces were mobilizing. Whittlesey shared the news quietly with his men, careful not to let excitement override caution. "Help is on the way," he said, his voice steady. "We have held, and now we will be relieved. Stand ready." A murmur of relief rippled through the lines, but fear lingered. It was not yet victory, only a promise. In the following hours, the battalion doubled down on defensive measures. Knowledge that help was coming invigorated them, but also sharpened their awareness of how precarious their position remained. Every movement could betray their location, every sound could draw fire. Men reinforced barricades, redistributed dwindling ammunition, and tended to the wounded with renewed urgency. Each action was measured, deliberate, a balance between preparation and anticipation. Whittlesey moved along the line, observing, encouraging, and silently acknowledging the courage surrounding him. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, sharing brief stories or jokes, small distractions against the crushing tension. Some wrote notes to loved ones, unsure if they would survive, yet compelled to leave a trace of themselves behind. Every heartbeat carried gratitude for survival and the fragile optimism of impending rescue. The Germans, meanwhile, were relentless. They probed, tested, and fired with precision, knowing the battalion's position was exposed. Artillery shells continued to splinter trees and churn the earth, but the message had shifted the battalion's psychological landscape. Hope was a weapon, subtle but potent. Every soldier felt it, an ember in the darkness, a reason to endure, a promise of reunion. Whittlesey prepared his men for the relief force, planning how to coordinate and signal when reinforcements arrived. Scouts and sharpshooters were repositioned, flanks reinforced, and lookout rotations adjusted. Every step was synchronized, a choreography of survival guided by experience and instinct. The battalion had endured days of isolation, and now the culmination of their efforts was within reach. As dawn approached, a new awareness filled the forest. The battalion's actions, long marked by desperation and fear, now bore the weight of strategy and hope. Men who had trembled under fire were steadier, those who had doubted their endurance now found renewed strength. Communication had changed everything. The lifeline delivered by a single pigeon had shifted the balance between despair and determination. But the battle was not yet over. Relief was approaching, yes, but the enemy remained vigilant, aware, and lethal. Every man understood that survival still demanded courage, focus, and sacrifice. The forest, indifferent and omnipresent, waited patiently, harboring danger in every shadow. And as the first rays of light pierced the canopy, the battalions steeled themselves. They had endured isolation, relentless fire, and the gnawing fear of abandonment. Now, the promise of rescue hung just beyond the trees, but could they hold until it arrived? The dawn mist clung stubbornly to the Argonne, but for the first time in days, the battalion felt a shift in the air, a promise carried on the wind. Beyond the thick canopy, a distant rumble suggested movement. Whittlesey's heart raced, though he kept his expression calm. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. The forest had been both enemy and prison, and its dangers were far from over. Through the trees, shapes emerged, figures moving with purpose. Allied forces had broken through, navigating the same treacherous terrain that had ensnared the 77th Division. Relief was finally within reach. Soldiers squinted through the haze, recognizing familiar uniforms and the hope they represented. Murmurs spread quickly, reinforcements. They've come for us. Yet the men remained wary. Every step closer carried risk. The Germans were still near, their machine guns poised to exploit any lapse. Whittlesey coordinated carefully. Signals were relayed, flares fired, and positions adjusted. Scouts and sharpshooters moved to secure approaches. Every man of the battalion understood that this final phase required discipline, vigilance, and courage equal to what they had shown for days under siege. The forest, dense and deceptive, still demanded respect. One misstep could turn hope into tragedy. As the relief forces advanced, a barrage of coordinated fire began. Artillery and machine gun support from the approaching Allies provided cover, forcing the Germans to retreat behind their lines. The battalion moved in concert, firing where necessary, holding their positions until the path was clear. The cacophony of battle echoed through the forest, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and anticipation. In the chaos, moments of humanity and heroism still emerged. Soldiers helped carry wounded comrades toward safety, medics worked feverishly alongside rescuers, and men shared brief words of encouragement, reminders of resilience, courage, and camaraderie. Whittlesey's presence remained steady, guiding, instructing, and observing the delicate choreography that was unfolding. The breakthrough came slowly, measured by cautious steps, returned fire, and careful navigation of the terrain. Finally, after days of isolation, bombardment, and uncertainty, the battalion's perimeter connected with the relief force. Men shouted, some laughing, others crying, as the weight of the siege began to lift. The forest that had felt like a trap now seemed less threatening, the danger receding as Allies surrounded and reinforced their lines. Whittlesey allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but he remained alert. The enemy was still present, and the forest could turn again with a single miscalculation. Yet for the first time, hope was tangible, almost palpable. The men had endured, survived, and now would live to tell the story of courage, sacrifice, and relentless perseverance. As the battalion withdrew under escort, the forest loomed behind them, a silent witness to the ordeal endured. Each soldier carried memories of friends lost, small victories won, and the knowledge that every heartbeat in those days had been a defiance of fate. The rescue had come, but the forest, and the trial it imposed, would linger in their minds forever. And in that quiet moment, amidst the smoke, mud, and fading gunfire, the men understood something profound. Survival was not just about strength or skill, but about endurance, courage, and the unyielding bond between those who refused to give up on each other. The forest of Argonne lay quiet now, broken only by the distant echo of retreating artillery and the soft shuffle of soldiers moving among the fallen. The siege was over, but its toll was written in mud, blood, and the weary ice off the 77th Division. The battalion had survived, yet survival came with the weight of loss, exhaustion, and memories that would not fade. Major Whittlesey walked slowly through the lines, observing men as they tended to wounds, shared scarce food, and whispered messages to loved ones. Faces were pale, uniforms torn, bodies scarred, but there was an undeniable spark of relief. They had endured what few thought possible, and now the world beyond the forest awaited, though forever changed in the minds of those who had lived through the ordeal. The human cost was staggering. Men who had displayed extraordinary courage lay motionless in the mud, reminders of the fragility of life even amidst triumph. Survivors moved carefully among them, pausing to pay silent respects, offering small gestures that could not undo the pain but acknowledged the sacrifice. Each loss was a story, a life that had contributed to the battalion's endurance and would be remembered. Whittlesey gathered his officers in a quiet grove, speaking softly yet firmly. "We have endured the unimaginable," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Each man here has displayed courage beyond measure. Remember the fallen, honor the living, and carry this story forward. The officers nodded, understanding that leadership extended beyond the battlefield. It was about preserving memory, valor, and the lessons forged in fire and mud. Letters were written, reports filed, and messages sent to higher command. But no amount of paper could capture the true essence of what had transpired in the forest. It was not only a story of strategy and combat, it was a story of endurance, moral courage, and the human spirit confronting fear, isolation, and overwhelming odds. Each man had faced death and emerged transformed, bonded by a shared struggle few could comprehend. For the men themselves, quiet moments became essential. Some sat by streams, washing away mud and blood, reflecting on the days that had felt like an eternity. Others simply stared into the trees, contemplating the randomness of survival, the horrors they had witnessed, and the comrades they had lost. The forest, once an adversary, now seemed like a solemn witness, guarding their memories and sacrifices. Yet amidst reflection, there was a sense of hope. The battalion had survived against overwhelming odds, demonstrating that courage, discipline, and unity could triumph over isolation and despair. News of their ordeal would spread, inspiring others and cementing their place in history. Whittlesey and his men understood that the lessons of the Argonne extended far beyond the battlefield. They were about endurance, humanity, and the unyielding strength found in the hearts of ordinary soldiers. As the sun set behind the distant horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the battalion began its march back to safety. Each step carried exhaustion, grief, but also a quiet pride. The forest had tested them, stripped them to the core, and revealed their resilience. And though the echoes of the siege would linger forever, the battalion had survived, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The battlefields of Argonne slowly returned to a deceptive calm. Trees still bore scars from artillery, mud still clung to every hollow and depression, and the echoes of gunfire seemed to linger in the mist. Yet, for the 77th Division, the war within the forest had ended. What remained was not only survival but the weight of memory, the legacy of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Major Charles Whittlesey stood quietly, surveying the battalion as men moved among the wounded, gathered belongings, and shared stories. Every face bore the marks of ordeal, exhaustion, loss, but also determination. They had survived isolation, relentless attacks, and the suffocating tension of being trapped. Their unity, resilience, and unwavering courage had carried them through what could have been annihilation. The story of the Lost Battalion would live beyond the forest. Newspapers, official reports, and military dispatches would attempt to capture the siege sevens, but none could fully convey the human drama, the fear, the heroism, the moral choices made under impossible conditions. Survivors carried those truths within them: the private who risked everything for his comrades, the medic who defied artillery to save lives, the leaders who bore the weight of impossible decisions. Whittlesey reflected on the nature of leadership, courage, and the bonds forged in extremity. The battalion's ordeal had revealed something profound: true heroism is often quiet, unseen, and born not from glory, but necessity. Every act of bravery, every sacrifice, was a thread woven into the tapestry of memory, ensuring that those who had fallen were honored, and those who survived carried their stories forward. The soldiers returned home as heroes, but not without scars. Memories of Argonne lingered in dreams, haunted moments of silence, and the quiet understanding that life had irrevocably changed. Some would speak of the siege in detail, others in fragments, and some would carry the stories silently, letting memory speak through actions rather than words. Yet the legacy of the battalion endured, a testament to human resilience under fire. In classrooms, history books, and family stories, the name Lost Battalion became synonymous with endurance against impossible odds. It was not merely a tale of military strategy, but of ordinary men exhibiting extraordinary courage, loyalty, and moral fortitude. The Argonne Forest became more than a battleground, it became a symbol of what could be achieved when fear was met with resolve and isolation met with unity. Whittlesey and his men understood that their ordeal had meaning beyond survival. It was a reminder of human capacity for courage, the bonds forged in adversity, and the importance of remembering those who had given everything. The Lost Battalion's story became a touchstone for generations, a lesson in perseverance, leadership, and the profound impact of shared sacrifice. As the sun set on the Argonne, painting the forest in gold and shadow, one truth endured: history remembers not only those who win battles, but those who endure them, who face impossible odds, and who emerge with humanity intact. The 77th Division had done just that. Their legacy was not written in headlines or medals alone, but in the quiet, enduring courage of men who refused to give up, and in the stories they carried for the rest of their lives. And in that legacy, every heartbeat of those 554 men continues to resonate, a reminder that courage, loyalty, and resilience define not just soldiers, but the very essence of the human spirit.